Struggling widower rescues a woman from a wreckage. Unaware, she owns half the land he works. The wind moved like an old widow across the prairie, slow, mournful, and without direction. What leaves still clung to the cottonwoods rustled like the hushed voices of the dead. The storm had passed in the night, a brutal tantrum of wind and lightning, and now the land lay hushed under a brooding sky that seemed reluctant to let go of its grief. Silas Boone stood alone on the south fence line, gloved hands braced against a post split clean in two by the storm. He studied the damage in silence, then knelt to begin the mending. His movements were patient, methodical, shaped by years of work that asked no questions and gave no praise. His back ached. His shoulder flared. He said nothing of it. He rarely spoke these days. Not since the fever took Mary and their boy. That winter had emptied the house, then hollowed out the man. He stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and worked because if his hands were still, his thoughts would rise. So he worked. A vulture floated high above the hill crest to the east, circling wide and low. Silas's eyes followed it out of habit, the way any man with livestock learns to. And then he saw it, thin black smoke, rising steady from the far end of the canyon, where the old trail snaked between cottonwoods. He stared for a moment, heart slow but certain, then rose and whistled for the horse. By the time he reached the wreckage, the air was thick with the scent of scorched wood and singed leather. A wagon lay twisted in the ravine, one wheel still slowly spinning, creaking like a dying breath. A mule lay broken nearby, its flank still twitching in a final tremor. He dismounted carefully, steps quiet, and approached with the caution of a man who's seen too much already. She was lying beside the wagon's overturned frame, face bruised, skirt torn, hair tangled with blood and ash. Her chest rose in short, ragged breaths. One boot was missing. Her hand clutched something to her chest, though he couldn't yet see what. Silas knelt beside her. Her eyes fluttered at the sound of his boots, dark and watchful even in pain. She didn't cry out, didn't beg, just looked at him like someone who had stopped expecting anything good a long time ago. "You alive?" His voice was gravel from disuse. She blinked once. He checked her limbs, one ankle badly twisted, ribs tender. A cut along her hairline, still bleeding slow. "You alone?" A small nod. He didn't ask more, just scooped her into his arms, awkward but careful, the way he might cradle a storm-shattered bird. The trail back was long, the mare uncertain under both their weight, but she didn't make a sound. She leaned into him only once, when the horse stumbled over a root, and he felt it, how small she was. Not in size, but in what was left. Back at cabin, the hearth still held warmth from that morning's fire. He laid her gently on the cot in the corner, his wife's old place, and pulled the wool blanket over her legs. She opened her eyes again as he turned to go. "Your name," she rasped. He paused. "Silas." A whisper of a nod. Her lips barely moved. "Abigail." He poured water from the pitcher and offered it in a tin cup. She drank without protest, then let her head fall back, breath softening. He tended to her cuts with an old cloth and a jar of sage salve, her skin warm under his fingers. She didn't flinch, though her jaw tightened at every sting. That night, after she'd fallen into sleep's loose hold, he sat at the table, watching the fire and the stranger it now lit. A woman alone, wrecked, and carrying nothing but a small satchel and silence. He should have felt unease. But what rose in him instead was something quieter. Not hope. Not yet. Just the stirring of something not quite sorrow. The next morning brought frost that painted every pane and rail in white. The mare stomped and snorted in the early cold. Silas brought in more firewood, stirred a pot of oats, then stepped into the room to check on her. She was awake, propped up against the headboard, her eyes clearer now, still wary but steady. "You eat?" he asked. A pause. "Not yet." He offered her a bowl and sat nearby, eating his own without speaking. After a time, she said, "The mule spooked. Lost a wheel in the turn. I tried to jump." He didn't ask what she was running from. The land was full of women running from something. "You headed somewhere?" She hesitated. "West. Thought I'd start again." He nodded, though his expression didn't change. Her eyes drifted to the room. Sparse weathered. A single shelf of books. A folded shawl on the back of a chair. A wall with a single picture nailed to it. A boy grinning under a too large hat, beside a woman with tired eyes and kind hands. Your family. His jaw tensed, but his voice was even. Was. A silence passed like a train through the prairie. Long, loud in its absence. I'm sorry, she said. He didn't reply. Later, while she slept again, he searched for more bandages. That's when he found it. Tucked deep in her satchel. Folded and creased from travel. A legal deed, water-stained and dirted at the edges. His eyes moved over the words, slow and certain. Abigail Wren, legal heir to the eastern half of Parcel 114, Boone Township, as per the will of Elias Wren. His mouth went dry. That was his land. Or what he thought was. He refolded the paper, tucked it back in, and stepped out into the morning sun that was beginning to melt the frost from the railings. His boots crunched through brittle grass as he walked toward the fence line again, though there was nothing left to fix. He just needed space. She owned half the land he worked, and yet she hadn't said a word. He ran a hand down his face, the stubble sharp against his palm. He didn't feel angry. Not yet. Just confused. The woman he carried in his arms yesterday wasn't a conniving sort. She looked like she'd been dropped out of a storm and had barely survived the landing. But that paper was real. He looked out at the field that had been his morning and his morning. Every inch he'd worked. Every blade of grass he'd buried memory beneath. And now it was only half his. When he returned, she was sitting upright, her leg propped on a pillow, eyes sharper than before. You found it. He didn't pretend otherwise. You plan on selling? Her shoulders tensed, but her voice was calm. No, I didn't come to sell. I came because I didn't have anywhere else. He stood in the doorway, tall and shadowed. This land's not easy. I'm not looking for easy. They looked at each other for a long while. He nodded once and stepped aside. You're welcome to stay until you're healed. She didn't smile, but she said, thank you, with something close to relief in her eyes. That evening, they didn't speak much. He brought in supper. She peeled apples with a dull knife and a wounded wrist. He sharpened the blade afterward without a word. Outside, the wind had died. The sky was clear for the first time in days. Inside, they shared a fire. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of it. As she slept, her breathing finally even and untroubled, Silas sat at the table with his hands folded and stared at the deed again. Folded now in his pocket. Heavy in a way it hadn't been earlier. There were choices to be made. Conversations to come. But not tonight. Tonight, he listened to the creak of the cabin's walls, the snap of the fire, and the soft presence of someone else breathing under the same roof. He had not felt this kind of stillness in a long, long time. And outside, the land waited, scorched in some places, still whole in others. The fence line would need mending again soon. But not everything had to be fixed at once. The first snow came early that year. Light, hesitant, the way a letter might arrive before the writer was ready to send it. It powdered the fields like sifted sugar and softened the hard lines of fence posts, roofs, and boot-worn paths. Silas watched it fall from the barn door, a mug of coffee warming his hands, steam curling into the silence that hung steady between the walls and the sky. Inside, Abigail Wren was already up, moving slower than most, but with a kind of deliberate grace. Her ankle remained swollen, wrapped in cloth and soothed with poultices he made from pine sap and willow bark, but she never complained. She used a broom like a cane, sweeping more for the rhythm of it than for need, and each morning insisted on helping with breakfast despite his quiet resistance. She asked for no charity. That much was clear. Silas noticed it in the way she folded her blanket each morning, tucked the corners like someone used to boarding houses and wariness. She never took more than she needed. She washed her dish. She never lingered in the bed, even when her pain flared. If he left tools on the porch, she lined them up. If the fire was low, she added a log. It was not gratitude she offered, it was dignity, and he respected that. On the third morning after the wreck, She sat by the window peeling potatoes, the dull knife flashing against the pale skin like slow lightning. He could see the bones in her wrist when she moved. Delicate things, but firm. She wasn't a large woman, but she was built like a crowbar, thin, forged, unyielding. "You'll hurt that ankle sittin' like that," he said, passing behind her. "I'm fine," she replied, not unkindly. He didn't argue. He'd already learned that when she said something, she meant it. Abigail Wren wasn't the sort to decorate a sentence with unnecessary flowers. Later, she hobbled outside to feed the hens. He followed, slow and unobtrusive. She had no gloves, and her hands went red in the cold, but she didn't flinch. She moved among the animals with quiet purpose, scattering seed like she'd been doing it all her life. The hens clucked approval. "Had chickens back east?" he asked. "My uncle raised them, after my husband left." He didn't look at her directly, just nodded barely, the way men do when they're listening without prying. She didn't speak for a moment. "Then he left after I lost the baby." Silas looked at her then, gently, a pause behind his breath. "He said I was broken," she added. The words dropped between them, not bitter, but matter-of-fact, like dried leaves shaken loose from a long-dead tree. He didn't rush to fill the silence, just leaned on the fence, arms crossed. "I'm sorry." Abigail gave a small shrug. "I was for a while. Then I stopped being sorry, and just kept going." The snow had begun to fall again, barely a whisper. Silas glanced at the clouds. Pale gray, threatening heavier weather. He offered her his coat. She hesitated only a second before sliding into it. It was far too big, the sleeves falling past her knuckles, but she didn't complain. "I should have told you about the deed earlier," she said as they walked back to the house. "You were half dead," he answered. "That's not an excuse." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but it's a reason." Inside, she settled back into the corner chair, leg propped, while he poured coffee for them both. She took it with both hands, like a prayer. "I didn't know the land was worked," she said after a long sip. "My uncle didn't say. Just left me the deed in a letter. Said I might find steadiness out here. Something worth keeping." Silas nodded. "He was a good man, your uncle." "You knew him?" "Not well. Saw him at supply runs. He'd sit outside the store like it was a front porch. Spoke with everyone, but didn't talk much." She smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." A warmth crept into her face then, softening the corners. Not quite beauty, not in the way men usually mean it, but something better. Presence. A kind of quiet conviction. He realized, watching her, that she hadn't come here to escape something. She'd come to claim something. A life. A plot of land. A name that still had meaning. And she would not be turned away. That evening, the wind howled louder, and the windows groaned against the cold. Silas added wood to the fire, while Abigail sat with needle and thread, repairing a tear in the flannel shirt he'd thrown over the back of a chair. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she answered. Her fingers worked deftly, despite the stiffness in her wrist. "But it's torn." Simple. Honest. Like her. After supper, they played a slow game of checkers. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was thoughtful. Silas had forgotten what that kind of silence felt like. Mary had brought it too, before the fevers. A kind of peace that needed no explanation. He caught Abigail watching the fire, eyes distant. "What were you hoping to build here?" he asked. She was quiet a moment. "I thought maybe a cabin. A porch. Somewhere quiet to read and grow things. Maybe teach children if the town ever builds a school." "You a teacher?" "I was once," she said. "Briefly. Before I married." He didn't press for more. She rose after the game and limped toward the back room, then paused at the doorway, hand resting lightly on the frame. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not asking too much." He met her eyes, steady. "People ask too much when they're trying to own things. I've had enough of that." A flicker of something, recognition, maybe, passed between them. The next few days moved with the quiet rhythm of two people building something they didn't yet name. Abigail began standing longer, putting weight on her ankle. She fed the chickens. She swept the porch. Silas found his tools sharpened and stacked without his asking. In return, he left coffee for her in the mornings. He cut the crust off her bread when he noticed her chewing was slow from a loose molar. He didn't mention it, just placed the bread with care and walked away. One morning, she caught him watching her through the window as she hung linens to dry. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the frost to dew. Her hands moved with that same fierce elegance, folding the sheets with military precision. "You always stare like that?" she asked through the window. He didn't flinch. "Only when I'm surprised." "By what?" "That you're still standing." She smiled, not broadly, but with truth. "So am I." That night, as they read near the fire, he with a well-worn trail guide, she with a book of poetry she'd salvaged from her trunk, he asked, "You planning to stay long?" She looked up slowly. "Would it be a problem?" He shook his head. "No." She closed her book gently. "Then I'll stay until I can stand without limping. After that, we'll see." He nodded. "Fair enough." As she stood to turn in for the night, her hand brushed the edge of the table, knocking a tin cup. It clattered loudly. She froze. Silas moved without comment, picked it up, set it back, and stepped aside. No scolding. No irritation. Just kindness, so quiet it didn't even raise its voice. She whispered, "Good night," and he answered with a quiet, "Rest well." Later, long after she'd gone, Silas stood alone outside beneath a sky thick with stars and the hush of snowfall returning. He looked out at the land, the fences, the barn, the battered stretch of pasture that now belonged half to someone else. But for the first time, it didn't feel like less. It felt like maybe, just maybe, something new, something beginning. And inside, behind a frosted window, a woman not yet finished with the world lay curled under a quilt, dreaming of a porch that might one day face the sunrise. Spring did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept in quiet as a thief, melting frost one breath at a time, softening the fields until the earth smelled of promise again. Shoots of green threaded through the brown, and the hens began laying regular again, as if coaxed by the warming light. Silas noticed the change in Abigail before the land itself. She limped less, stood longer by the fence at sunrise. Her face had grown less hollow, her eyes less guarded. She wore her hair up now, not always pinned, but gathered in a way that said she had started to care again, not about how she looked, but how she felt. She moved with the grace of someone who remembered her own weight and worth. They worked side by side, without much talk, each falling into rhythm with the other. Silas never asked her to stay. Abigail never said she would. But her presence threaded through the days like the grain in worn wood, subtle, unmistakable. Then came the letter. It arrived in town, addressed in ink gone pale from damp and time. Silas had gone in for feed and returned with it tucked between bags of oats and nails. Abigail read it slowly, sitting on the porch with her fingers tight around the paper. Silas didn't ask what it said. But later that evening, she walked out to the edge of the east field, where the fence dipped low and the soil grew darker, richer. She stared long at the land, not just at what it was, but at what it might be. The next morning, she spread a map across the kitchen table, yellowed, creased, its ink faded at the edges. "This is it," she said, drawing a line with one finger. "My uncle's parcel ran from the creek bend here, all the way north to the bluff." Silas didn't speak. He was looking at the line too, because he'd walked that ground, planted fence posts deep in it, worked it with the heels of his boots and the sweat of his brow. "You've been tending half of it," she continued, gently, without knowing. He nodded once, slow. "I'm not here to take it back," she added, voice steady. "But I want to make my claim clear. If there's to be building, planting, partnership, we ought to know where the line stands." Silas leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "You thinking to build?" "Eventually," she said. "A small house. Nothing grand. Just enough for a bed, a stove, a rocking chair." She smiled faintly. "Maybe even a porch." He said nothing, but something in his jaw shifted, a flicker of thought behind the stillness. Days passed, and word spread, how things always did in towns like theirs. First to the clerk, then to the storekeeper's wife, then to anyone with ears to carry it further. It wasn't long before a man rode out to see Abigail Wren himself. He arrived dressed finer than the wind warranted. Polished boots, bright buttons, smile too practiced. Caleb Finch. He introduced himself like a man used to being heard. Land agent, he claimed, with connections to new buyers, rail lines, livestock ventures, oil men sniffing around the territory. "I've seen your deed, Miss Wren," he said, tipping his hat with grease-slick fingers. "Prime soil you've inherited. That east parcel's worth more than a few garden beds." "I'm not looking to sell," Abigail answered calmly, not rising from her chair. He laughed, soft and patronizing. "Of course not now. But time has a way of changing a person's needs. Thought I'd come by, introduce myself, in case opportunity knocks." Abigail watched him evenly. "And if it doesn't?" He shrugged. "Then I reckon you'll want to know who's knocking anyway." When he left, Silas found her near the barn, her hands clenched tighter than the twine she was trying to cut. "He'll be back," she said. "I know. I don't trust him." "Nor should you." They didn't say more. But something changed in the air between them, sharpened like the scent before rain. The next week brought windstorms, strong enough to knock the porch chairs over and scatter kindling like thrown dice. Silas secured the roof, mended the west fence. Abigail kept indoors, drawing plans on scraps of paper salvaged from flour sacks, sketches of cabins, modest and square. She didn't share them, but Silas glimpsed them once, and the sight stayed with him. There were flowers drawn near the windows. He began to realize something then, that she wasn't just reclaiming land. She was reclaiming herself. They began speaking of the boundary not as a line between them, but a line to be understood. She offered to share the pasture if he helped with the plowing. He offered lumber he'd saved for repairs, enough to raise her cabin frame when she was ready. It was not generosity. It was respect. Still, unease lingered. Caleb Finch returned, more insistent. This time with papers, offers, promises. Abigail didn't flinch. She read them slowly, lips tight. When he pushed, she replied with quiet finality. "I'm not leaving. You'd be better off building where men won't bother you. I've been bothered by better." Caleb's eyes narrowed, all charm evaporated. "You think this land will stay peaceful? You've got no husband, no name here. That man's not yours. And this land's too valuable to waste on flower beds and fairy tales." Silas, standing silent until then, stepped forward. His voice was low, iron-edged. "She said she's not selling. You heard it. Now get off this land." Caleb looked from one to the other. He saw then that Abigail Wren wasn't alone, and whatever stake she held, it was backed by something steady. "I'll be back," he muttered, mounting his horse. Silas watched him ride away, dust trailing behind. "You think he'll come back with more?" Abigail asked. "Maybe. Or someone meaner." "I'm not afraid." He believed her. That night, she stood beside the fire, holding a folded letter. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the flames like they might answer something she couldn't ask aloud. "My uncle's letter came with the deed," she said finally. "Said he hoped I'd find steadiness out here. That I'd build something gentle, something that was mine." Silas nodded. "Sounds like a good man." He was. But I think what he really meant was that I'd stop running. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands did, just slightly, enough to notice. He took the letter from her, folded it again, and placed it on the mantel. "You're not running now," he said. She looked at him, eyes shining, but unshed. "I've spent years trying to be wanted," she whispered. "By men, by cities, by silence, and none of it ever felt like a place." Silas didn't move, but his voice softened. "Sometimes a place isn't where you start. It's who lets you stay." They stood there in the warmth, with nothing more to prove. The next morning, Abigail rose early, tied back her hair, and began walking the line of her land. She stepped carefully over old roots, touched the trunks of cottonwoods, knelt to press her palm to the soil. She whispered something to it, words the wind carried off before they could be heard. Later, she came back with dirt under her nails and plans in her pocket. She laid them on the table, without ceremony. "This is where I'll build," she said. "A small cabin, maybe a room for books, enough space for seeds. I'll need help with the foundation." Silas nodded once. "I'll get the plow ready." And in that exchange, no contract signed, no hand shaken, a pact was made. Not ownership, not possession, just two people standing side by side on land that had once belonged to neither, and now quietly belonged to both. A week later, Abigail stood again at the edge of the property. The field stretched before her, gold just beginning to peek through the thaw. She held a hammer in one hand, blueprints in the other. The wind kicked up, tugging at her skirt. She didn't move, didn't bend, didn't break. Behind her, Silas walked up with a bag of nails slung over one shoulder and a saw in his hand. "Let's begin," he said. And together they did. The wind had teeth that day. It came sharp from the west, lashing across the dry plains with a warning no one could ignore. By late morning, the sky was a pale, sickly yellow. Dust scuttled over the earth like frightened insects. Even the horses grew restless, stamping and tossing their heads, their ears flicking toward something unseen but deeply felt. Abigail stood on the porch with one hand shielding her eyes. The horizon had changed. A darker smudge swelled against the edge of the sky, low and creeping. Not a storm, not clouds, smoke. She turned. Silas was already tightening the cinch on his saddle, movements brisk and measured. His face was set, unreadable. "Where is it?" she asked. "Up past Wilkes Hill. Moving fast." She glanced toward the east fields, where grass stood dry and high. "You think it'll reach us?" "Not today," he said. "But wind like this, it won't take much." She didn't argue. Fire, like grief, didn't need permission. It just needed an opening. "I'm coming with you." "No." His answer came quick, clipped, the way a man speaks when fear is trying to hide inside command. "I'm not staying behind," Abigail replied, already untying the water barrels. He turned, mouth open to protest, but something in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't being stubborn. She was being steady. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay close." By the time they reached the ridge, the smoke had thickened. A black-gray curtain dragging its hem across the treetops. Silas dismounted first, helping Abigail down with care, though her limp had all but vanished. Together, they joined the line of neighbors gathering near the Wilkes barn, faces drawn, eyes scanning the wind, each person carrying whatever tools they had. Shovels, blankets, buckets. There wasn't time for strategy, only instinct. Abigail took a place beside the Henleys, passing filled buckets along the chain. Her hands burned with every haul, but she didn't stop. Heat pressed from the west like a slow, cruel hand, and the smoke stung sharp enough to make her eyes weep. Silas worked closer to the blaze, shoveling dirt over advancing flames, stamping out brush before it could leap to the trees. His shirt clung to him, sweat-soaked, his face streaked with soot and resolve. Abigail watched him through the haze, her chest tightening with something deeper than fear. He moved like he'd done this before, like someone who understood loss. A cry went up. Sparks had jumped the break. Fire licked the edge of the dry wheat just a quarter-mile off. They needed to reroute the line. "Abigail, stay here," Silas called, voice raw from smoke. She nodded, but as he turned, she caught sight of a young steer trapped near the fence, lowing in panic as fire crept toward the pen. No one else saw it. She moved before she thought. The gate was twisted, stuck. She climbed over, stumbling once, the heat clawing at her dress. The animal thrashed as she approached, frightened and blind. Abigail kept her voice low, steady, coaxing like she used to with the schoolchildren back in Ohio. She looped a rope around his neck, tugged gently. "Come on," she whispered. "Just you and me." The steer bolted, nearly pulling her over, but she held firm. Her wrist screamed, old pain flaring to life. The world narrowed to smoke and noise and the pounding of her heart. When she reached the far gate, someone pulled it open from the other side. Strong hands grabbed the rope. "Silas, what the hell were you thinking?" he rasped, voice thick with fury and fear. She was coughing too hard to answer. He swept her up, no time for argument, and carried her to the far side of the fire line, where the air was clearer. He set her down behind a hay cart and knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders like they were the only solid things left. "You could have." "But I didn't," she whispered, between gasps. He looked at her, truly looked, and in the space between their ragged breaths, something passed, something that felt like the thin line between what was almost lost and what might still be saved. They stayed there as the fire was slowly pushed back, beaten inch by inch with sweat and shovels. When night fell, the wind died suddenly, as if the prairie had exhausted itself. Embers flickered low, and the worst had passed. Silas helped Abigail to her feet. Her skin was streaked with ash, her dress torn at the hem, but her eyes were sharp, still burning in a different way. They rode home in silence, the horse moving slow, picking its way through darkened trails and the ghost scent of smoke. At the cabin, Abigail collapsed into a chair while Silas lit the lantern. Its golden light wavered, catching on her soot-darkened face. He handed her a wet cloth. She wiped her hands, then her cheeks, quiet. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said at last. "I know. I just couldn't leave it." He knelt in front of her, resting one hand lightly on her knee. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said softly. "My Mary. She was always going back into the burning parts of things, always trying to save what she could." Abigail's throat tightened. "I'm not her. I know that too." He rose, poured her a cup of water, handed it to her with a steadiness that felt like trust. She drank slowly, then looked up. "I don't know if this land can hold me," she admitted. Silas leaned against the wall, arms crossed, gaze thoughtful. "No land holds anyone," he said. "We hold it. With our work. With our choices. With what we're willing to stay for." Abigail let those words settle. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. A sketch of the cabin she still hoped to build. It was smudged now, edges singed. But the lines remained. "I want this," she said. "Not the fire. Not the fear. Just this." He nodded, voice low. "Then we build it." The next morning, they rose before the sun, the sky still bruised from the night smoke. They walked the eastern field in silence, stepping around blackened grass and damp ash. At the northern corner, where the soil had stayed unburned, Abigail paused. "This is where it should be," she said. Silas looked at the ground, then at her. "Then we start here." She turned to him, the wind lifting strands of her hair, now streaked faintly with soot and snow. "You never asked what I lost," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She watched the land a moment longer. It was a daughter, stillborn. The words didn't crack. They were shaped like stone, weathered, real. "I buried her without a name," Abigail continued, "because the name felt too heavy for something that didn't get to stay." Silas didn't offer pity, just presence. "Maybe," he said after a long pause, "this place can carry her name instead." Abigail's lips parted, not in surprise, but in quiet recognition. Her hand found his. It stayed there. The wind shifted then, gentler now, and the smoke in the sky began to lift, revealing patches of soft blue. They turned back toward the house, walking together with ash on their boots, and something unspoken beginning to bloom in the silence between them. Something that couldn't be burned. The snow fell soft as breath. No wind, no howl, no warning. Just a slow drift from a sky the color of unspun wool, each flake settling with reverence on the land. Smoke curled gently from the cabin's chimney, and inside, warmth wrapped itself around Abigail and Silas like a memory returned. The scent of coffee, wood smoke, and cinnamon bark filled the room, mingling with the hush that came after fire, after fear, after truth. Outside, the land was changed. Charred patches still streaked the east field, like old scars not yet grown over. But between them, green. Shoots. Signs of life stubborn enough to rise from ash. Abigail had walked those paths every morning, tracing the line where ruin had ended and something else had begun. She took her coffee on the porch now, wrapped in a shawl, watching the world become again. A week had passed since the fire, since she'd spoken her daughter's name aloud for the first time in years. They hadn't spoken of it since. That kind of grief didn't require repetition. It asked only to be held, not healed. Today, a different silence filled the cabin. On the table between them lay 2 envelopes. One worn, yellowed, edges curled from travel. The other crisp, sealed with the wax of town authority. Both addressed to Abigail Wren. She picked up the first. Her uncle's last letter. The one she'd carried and avoided, folded and refolded, tucked inside her coat like a private wound. Now, with Silas nearby, but saying nothing, she opened it. Abigail, it began, in the uneven hand of an old man who'd never written for beauty. If you're reading this, I've gone. And you've come. I hope the land is still there. I hope you found your way west and put your hands in the soil. I hope it feels like yours. I gave it to you because I remembered you as a girl, quiet, fierce, kind when no one was watching. I saw the way you wanted more than what was handed to you. The way you kept your sorrow tucked behind your teeth, but didn't let it turn you cruel. This land has held a lot of stories. Some bitter, some blessed. But I believe it can still carry something good. Something new. Not for what it gives back, but for what it allows to take root. Don't sell it. Not unless your heart demands it. Build something gentle. Let it shelter you. Let it remind you that you are not broken. You are beginning. Abigail read the last line twice. Then she laid it down, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from release. I didn't know he saw me like that, she said, her voice small, shaped by wonder. He saw you clear, Silas said. Same as I do. The other envelope sat untouched. She opened it slowly. A formal claim acknowledgement from the county office, confirming the deed transfer and map revision. The land, her land, was now officially recorded. A line drawn, stamped, signed. Abigail folded it neatly and placed it beside the letter. It's mine now, she said quietly. Silas looked at her, eyes steady, voice low. What do you want to do with it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she rose and walked to the window. Snow kissed the earth outside. Smoke rose from the shed where they stored supplies. A frame waited near the east ridge, half-built, beams lashed with rope, a porch already imagined. I want to finish the house, she said. I want to plant herbs and hang laundry and read at the window when it rains. I want to wake up in a place that feels earned, not given. And the rest. I want you near, she said, turning toward him. If you still want to be. He stood slowly, as though the moment asked for reverence. I've wanted that since the day you stopped apologizing for being here. They stepped closer, the warmth between them no longer tentative, but inevitable. He reached for her hand, not in possession, but in promise. A knock shattered the stillness. They froze. It came again, harder, hurried. Silas opened the door. Caleb Finch stood on the porch, hat in hand, boots caked in snow and mud. Behind him, a horse blew steam into the cold. I thought you'd gone, Silas said, voice like flint. I did. But I came back with a real offer. You've been told no, Abigail said, stepping forward. You've been underinformed, he replied, flashing a thin smile. There's a buyer, real interest this time. Rail expansions moving faster than expected. That land of yours, Abigail, it's about to triple in value. Maybe more. I'm not selling. He stepped closer. Think what you could do. A schoolhouse. A shop. Move into town. You could have comfort. I already have peace, she said. I've no need for comfort that comes with strings and strangers. Caleb's smile vanished. You're making a mistake. No, she said. I'm making a life. Silas moved between them then, not threatening, just present. You should go. For a moment, Caleb seemed to consider saying more. But the resolve in Abigail's eyes made him hesitate. He nodded once, sharp and bitter, then turned back to his horse. They watched him ride away until he vanished beyond the ridge. Inside, Abigail exhaled. Her knees shook, but she stayed standing. That was the last test, she whispered. I could feel it. Silas placed a steadying hand on her back. You passed. Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped. The world looked new again. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it gently on the railing. She unwrapped it. A hand-carved sign. Letters burned deep and careful into the wood. Boone and Wren Ranch. Abigail stared at it, heart in her throat. "It's not just yours," he said. "Not just mine. It's what we built between." Her eyes brimmed, but no tears fell. Instead, she lifted the sign, her grip sure. "I know where to hang it." Together, they walked to the edge of the property, where fire had once threatened and flowers were now beginning to bloom. He held the post steady. She nailed it in place. Each strike rang like a heartbeat. The sign stood firm in the fading light. They lingered there, hand in hand, as evening painted the sky in gold and soft violet. The wind rose gently, lifting her hair, whispering through the fields with a voice that no longer sounded like morning. They had chosen to stay, to build, to belong. And in the silence that followed, where once there had been loneliness and ash, there was now a name, a home, and two people who had risked being seen. Abigail turned to Silas, her voice no longer afraid to hope. "Would you like to come inside?" He smiled, warm and whole. "I already am." If this story moved you, please let me know. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear that, and also like, comment, and subscribe.